Hey, how's it going? In this video, we're going to go over installing Docker with and without Docker Desktop on Arch Linux. We're also going to go over some benchmarks between the two because technically on native Linux, you don't need to install Docker Desktop, but there are some benefits there which we're going to cover here too. So throughout this video, we're going to be bouncing around this blog post here for a fair bit, and then also going through the steps actually installing these things here. And I'm running my desktop machine here, which I'm recording this video on. We are going to be installing Docker Desktop there as well. So you see all these different steps in action. So right now this blog post is hosted on localhost. By the time you watch it, it'll be of my live site. I'll leave a link to that one in the description. So, technically on native Linux, you don't need to install Docker Desktop to run Linux containers, but depending on what your preferences are and what Docker features you're interested in, then it's, in my opinion, very much worth looking into. And that kind of, leads into this question here. Should you use Docker Desktop on Linux? Because Docker Desktop nowadays is more than just an optional GUI to interact with a whole bunch of different Docker resources, right? Containers, images, volumes, etc. Docker Desktop has evolved a lot over the last 10 years when it was introduced in about 2016 for Windows and Mac. Nowadays has a whole bunch of different features and it's improving all the time. So at the time of this post, mid 2026 here, the full version of Docker Gordon, that's an exclusive feature of Docker Desktop. So if you go and check it out here, you can see that it requires Docker Desktop here. And, this is basically their Ask Gordon prompt here for getting, insights and information about Docker related material. Now, technically on Docker's documentation and Docker Hub and maybe some other areas of the site, there is this nice little Gordon prompt here where you can kind of get some information. But, this is like internally classified as Gordon Lite. It doesn't have all the same features that you would get on Docker Desktop. And also, if you like getting that assistance around, Docker concepts and commands, from the comfort of Docker Desktop and the CLI, that's something to consider. Maybe you want to install Docker Desktop just for that. And by the way, in this case here, there is CLI support, but that does depend on Docker Desktop being available. And again, as just mentioned, technically Gordon's available to use on Docker's website, but it's not the same product as what's available with Docker Desktop. Now, with that said, in practice, I do find that Docker oftentimes introduces features for Docker Desktop first. Over the years, I just noticed that those features started off as being made for Docker Desktop, but then were split out and made independent to work without it. I don't know if that's going to happen here with Gordon, but it certainly has happened with other things in the past. Now, with that said, on Arch Linux, if you want to use most of Docker's offerings here, stable features, beta, experimental, etc., then I would highly suggest using Docker Desktop because while you can technically run most of the other things without it, it's just a lot more painful to set up. You find yourself having to track down dependencies, accumulating some scripts here to get everything up and running, or maybe hunting around the AUR to pull in everything together. One big benefit around Docker Desktop in that regard is you just install it once. It facilitates installing and managing these features and plugins. And it's kind of nice just to be able to set it and forget it, right? Not have to think about missing out on all the features that Docker is releasing. Maybe one question here is well, what do I do? So personally, I actually use both. So I do have a laptop and a desktop, and they're both using Arch Linux. They're both using the same dot files minus a couple different configuration details, right? This is the DotFriedRice project over here, which, by the way, we're going to go over a little bit later on installing everything here. If you are using this DotFriedRice, then Docker's already pre-installed and you can switch over to Docker Desktop, but we're going to go over the manual steps here. So if you're not using that, then don't worry about it. But on my laptop, I have Docker Desktop, and on my desktop, I use the CLI version. This kind of lets me use Docker's latest and greatest features and also provide feedback to Docker, since I am a Docker captain here, without any worries. I do use the laptop from time to time. It's not something I just touch once a year. So I'm actively using Docker Desktop quite a bit here. And I also have the same Dockerized projects here synced between both devices, and it's no problem at all to run them without any adjustments. For example, this blog over here, it's synced over to my laptop. I might be writing a blog post on my desktop, but also maybe I'm outside writing a blog post, just sitting on the grass, on the laptop using Docker Desktop there, and it's great. By the way, again, if you're using DotFriedRice, it's easy to get going with either solution. We'll go over this a little bit later here. Now, it's kind of interesting, right? To run Docker Desktop, you are running a VM there, even on Linux as well. So is that extra VM resource hungry or slow compared to just installing Docker directly on your machine? And not really, right? There are some differences, but maybe they're not as big as you might think, or maybe it really depends on your use cases here. We're actually going to go over some benchmarks here as well. Now, the KVM backed VM, it does use about 1 gig of memory, and it pre-allocates around 16 gigs of disk space. That's to set up the VM itself, independent of whatever Docker images that you have. And of course, these are unofficial measurements, right? I kind of just looked at BTOP, eyeballed some of the Docker Desktop processes. It's about 1 gig of memory, maybe it's a little bit less. And then when it came to the disk space here, I just looked at a couple of different directories. Basically, we're running command commands like this. And we'll mention too that, Docker Desktop on Linux, it is going to use dynamic CPU, memory, and disk allocation as well. In other words, if you're not running anything, then it's not pre-allocating a bunch of those resources. For example, in the Docker Desktop settings, you might give Docker Desktop something like 4 CPU cores or maybe up to 8 gigs of memory, but it's not just going to use all that stuff just for the sake of being allocated, right? It's only going to start using those resources when you actually need to use them. And these kind of just act as basically an upper limit for things that are set up there. But yeah, also when it comes to this disk space here, likewise, it is going to just keep growing as the demand increases here based on the images that you have. I will mention here too that 16 gigs of space here. I did do a complete Docker system prune before doing everything there, just to make sure that, some of the images weren't at play there. But yeah, okay, let's go over maybe some real world benchmarks here. So even on my desktop machine from 2014, don't notice any huge differences here for performance when using it on real projects. With that said, I haven't run any micro benchmarks to confirm the actual differences between like CPU, memory, disk IO, network, etc., because it was never slow enough for me to actually investigate and spend the time to do that. In this case here, the real world benchmark will be my blog. So it uses Hugo, which is a static site generator. I've written a 10,000 word blog post of switching over to that if you're interested. But yeah, it uses ESBuild along with Hugo. So ESBuild is handling things like compiling JavaScript and CSS, and Hugo is assembling all these different files to basically produce a directory in the end that I can then serve with something like Nginx or another web server. But all of that is running through Docker using Docker Compose. There's over 1,000 posts here, including the drafts, and there are thousands upon thousands of images, thumbnails and photo galleries, etc. Building this site is quite CPU intensive and also involves volume mounting thousands of files. Basically, it's a worst case scenario. And for my reference here, I did some before and after with Docker Desktop on my laptop, which is actually quite a bit stronger than my desktop. We're going to see a little benchmarks with the desktop as too, because, I will be installing Docker Desktop live in this video here on my desktop machine here. But in any case, the laptop is a Ryzen 7 6800H. It's got 32 gigs of memory. There's an integrated iGPU there that can use up to 8 gigs. It's got an NVMe SSD drive here, basically some of the stats that you see here. It's running DotFriedRice, whatever, Neri, blah, 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 Arch Linux, vanilla, etc. And okay, so on my laptop with Docker Desktop, ESBuild will compile all the CSS and JavaScript in about half a second, right? 600 milliseconds. And the entire site gets fully built in about 4 seconds. That's, Hugo going like, okay, cool. I'm going to go produce this entire output directory. I'm going to go through all the different files that you have and get everything set up here. And also if I modify a post incrementally, that rebuilds the site in about 350 milliseconds. For example, this is running right now. So if I go here and take a look here at this blog post, just around where we are now, like if I just go and go go to the blog post here, you can see there it is. And I'm recording a video too, a lot of things going on. This is also my desktop, not the laptop. But in any case here, let me get rid of that. We go back to here and it's already gone. So yeah, on my laptop without Docker Desktop now, right? No Docker Desktop here, Docker Desktop here. Then, ESBuild, it's about the same, right? I don't have a ton of assets here for getting this all set up here in the blog, but the entire site gets built in 2 seconds. So it's about twice as fast here without Docker Desktop. And modifying a post incrementally also rebuilds in about 115 milliseconds, let's call it. So, you could say, okay, this is three times faster here, but it's also a 200 millisecond difference here. And, but even having this side by side by my editor, that 200 milliseconds, it is a delay, but it's not something that I really feel too much here. And by the way, these times, they're all printed by the processes when you actually run them. So for example, going back to here, this is the Compose project up and running here. You can see, okay, cool. It took 146 milliseconds for that to rebuild there. And, if I scroll up around here somewhere else, then we'll see more information about some of the things being set up here. You can see, oh, it took 5.5 seconds here to build the whole site on my desktop machine from 2014. But okay, cool. I just want to let you know that I'm not just writing some custom calculations here. These tools are just providing those outputs here. But when you look at the above here, you might think well, wow, Docker Desktop, it is way worse. On paper, it's twice as slow in some spots like this, for example here, but it really makes close to zero difference in my day-to-day, right? I do site rebuilds a few times a week here. Waiting an extra 2 seconds here or there is not really a big deal. And keep in mind, this slowness that we're seeing, it's not because Docker Desktop is coded poorly. This is basically the VM tax, right? KVM is a type 1 hypervisor, and it does have direct access to your hardware, but it and Docker Desktop, they still need to facilitate sharing files from your host into a VM. For example, these files that we were just looking at before, they are existing on disk on my hard drive within, the Arch Linux OS here within an ext4 file system, but that needs to get sent into the VM here where Docker engine is running, etc. So yeah, there is going to be a penalty for that here. And yeah, I don't know, if you have a massive project where you're constantly running really disk heavy operations all the time, maybe that's something to consider here, but I have a hunch for most workloads, web applications, running test suites, compiling whatever code that you have here, it's one of the situations where it's going to be fast enough. And by the way, my desktop, the one recording this video now, it has way worse hardware than the laptop, right? It has an i5-4460 from 2014. It's only got 4 cores. It doesn't even have hyper-threading, so logical cores are still 4. 16 gigs of memory, whatever has AMD RX 480 here, the 8 gig version. And it has a first gen SSD that's a SATA one, right? It's not an NVMe, but it is running, basically the same setup here, same dot files. Maybe I didn't reboot here, so it's still running an Arch kernel that's a tiny bit outdated here, but whatever, not a big deal. You can see the uptime has been over a week here. But yeah, for reference though, on my desktop machine, this machine here without Docker Desktop, 650 milliseconds to build the static files, about 4 seconds here to fully rebuild with Hugo, and then incremental is 120 milliseconds. And we go back up here, just keep an eye out here, right? Without Docker Desktop, 650 for 120. And 650 for 120, we go without Docker Desktop, 550 to 115 or whatever. So the top and the third one, these are basically the same. And yeah, okay, it's quite a bit slower here on my desktop machine. Again, it's like almost comparable to what Docker Desktop here on the laptop. That's because, this is pretty CPU bound. So for example, once the bottleneck of disk IO has been reduced there, yeah, I'm quite CPU bound here on this machine here. Again, because there's only 4 physical cores, whereas the laptop has 8 physical, 16 logical there, right? Cool. Okay. So going back down to here again, yeah, I guess to follow along with the post here, it's also worth pointing out, right? The laptop has an NVMe SSD where the desktop has a first gen SATA one, blah, blah, blah from 2014. Disk IO is still quite good on both machines, but it's certainly a task that's disk heavy in general. Now, people do ask me all the time, this is a quick aside, why don't I just buy a new desktop computer? Why the heck am I using something from 2014? It's because it doesn't feel slow, like truly, like I'm not lying. Like it runs these Dockerized workflows really, really well, as well as other things, video editing and media editing, etc. Anyways, cool. Okay, so that's kind of the story between, maybe if you want to use Docker Desktop or not. Now let's go over actually installing Docker, both the CLI version at first, and then Docker Desktop. And also we're going to go over, how to remove some of the CLI stuff here if you just want to go pure Docker Desktop. And this is actually what I have installed right now on the desktop. So I'm actually not going to be running these commands exactly with you just because I already have them installed. It's going to be basically a no op and no operation here. But in any case here, if we go and take a look here at Arch's repository, there is a Docker package here that's officially maintained by the folks over at Docker, so totally safe to install here. But yeah, this is going to install Docker. It's also going to install BuildX, and then it's also going to install Docker Compose. These are both plugins here for Docker. In my opinion, they're very useful to have, right? I run a ton of Docker Compose projects here, and the backend for using BuildX to build your images, very nice to have here. Also, you want to make sure to add your user to the Docker group. That's what this command does over here. If you don't do this, then technically you won't be able to run Docker without root access. You have to run like sudo docker, etc. This gets by needing to avoid doing that. And we'll mention here too, though, when you do set this here, you will need to log out of your session here and then log back in. For example, I am using Neri here. I would just go, if you're using DotFriedRice, you can kind of just log out and log back in, or you could just reboot your machine. But if you don't want to reboot right now, just maybe you're installing Docker for the first time, then you can just run this straight in your terminal, and your current terminal session will then be good to go here. But again, if you open up like a second terminal, you have to run this command again. But again, that's only temporary for now. After rebooting or logging out and logging back in, you'll never have to run this command here. But finally, after that, you want to make sure the Docker daemon is started, and also it starts on boot. So you can just use, systemctl here to enable the service so it comes up when you reboot, and you also want to make sure it's started now, and that's going to be for the Docker service. So once you have these running here, then that's it. You're going to have Docker and Docker Compose available for you to run. It's going to have everything all set up here. And by the way, Docker Compose and like BuildX, these are all separate projects, typically because on Arch Linux, it's really common not to bundle third-party binaries in another package if they can be released separately. So that's why you need to maybe individually install Docker BuildX. You might be wondering, like, why isn't that just enabled, or why isn't that just included with the Docker package by itself? Although with Docker Compose, kind of makes sense to have that as a complete separate thing. But yeah, then you can run some commands like this just to verify things are working, right? You can run a container, the hello world container. So let's actually run that here and see it work. So here we go. I actually don't think I have it, or technically I do, I guess. So, but yeah, you should see an output that like this, right? Hello from Docker. You are good to go. We can also do something like a Docker and then BuildX version. That's going to get you the version. And then also here you can do the same thing for Compose and then get the version here as well. You should see whatever version. Again, depending on when you watch this video, then these outputs might look a little bit different depending on what versions are available. Going back to here, same commands here. Cool. you are all set. You can now run Docker and Docker Compose projects. All it took was a couple of minutes here, a couple of commands, and you were good to go. So now let's go over installing Docker Desktop here. And again, I'm going to do the stuff live on my system so you can see how things go here. We're actually going to go over the cleaning up Docker Engine, Docker Compose setup here as well, because as we just saw, I have all the stuff installed on my machine. So if you already have Docker Engine and Docker Compose installed, you'll need to at least remove the buildx and compose plugins here. You can do that by running these commands here. Now, I will say when it comes to installing Docker Desktop later, which you're going to do from the AUR, which is also maintained by the Docker folks, most AUR helpers like Yay, Paro, etc., they will offer to remove these conflicting packages, but I think it's a good idea to know what's happening ahead of time. So let's actually just remove these together here. So I'm going to go and remove these. Clear the screen so we have more room here, but cool. Okay, so I'm going to remove Docker buildx as well as Docker Compose. This is going to be kind of interesting because I'm actually running this Compose up project at the same time. So let me actually close that out. It's not going to, get rid of the blog post. It just won't have any live updates. But yeah, in this case here, we're going to totally remove this package, all its, sub dependencies and everything. So let's do this. Whoop, I don't think I typed that right. Okay, there we go. I learned how to type. So in this case, yeah, we're going to remove Docker buildx as well as Compose. Yep, that's what we want to do. And there it goes. Okay, so that's step one. Now, when it comes to the Docker package, you can have Docker continue to run independent of Docker Desktop if you want. That's because when you use the Docker CLI through Docker Desktop, it actually sets up a separate context here. So it uses the VM's Docker engine instead of your main system's Docker engine. Basically, it's a way for you to switch context, switch what Docker engine is going to be used when you run some Docker commands here. In fact, Docker Desktop is going to install the Docker package just for the CLI, which is why we're not removing it right now. Otherwise, it will get reinstalled anyways. However, those conflicting packages there for buildx and compose, you can't have them exist at the same time as Docker Desktop. And since that's not a capability there, I don't know, most of the projects, at least for me, I'm just like facilitating all that through Docker Compose. So I wouldn't suggest keeping your Docker service running. You can totally, but it's going to remain unused there since Docker Desktop runs the Docker daemon in the VM there. And again, the above is kind of just a general guideline for me. Maybe you do have some really super disk heavy operations that's not using Docker Compose, and you do find yourself wanting to use Docker Desktop a majority of the time, but maybe you have that one project using some Docker containers there, and you just want to have the faster disk IO there. So maybe you just use the Docker daemon running straight on your host for that one. So you could totally do that if you want, but yeah, I just wanted to call that out here. But in my case here, I'm actually going to disable and stop the Docker servers, the Docker socket, as well as containerd services. These are dependencies of Docker here. We're going to stop all of them here. So I'm going to go here, run this command as well, clear the screen, why not? And then, yeah, this is going to prevent it from coming up on boots here, and everything has been disabled successfully here. We don't need to worry too much about these warnings. Cool, nice. All right, what else? Now we have an actual decision point here. Do you want to keep around your old images and volumes? So we just uninstalled some Docker-related packages. We just stopped the systemd service. However, all of the Docker images that you might have lying around, they're still there. So, we could choose to do a prune all, -- volumes. By the way, don't just blindly run that. That's going to remove all the images and volumes from your system. If you're using Docker, that wouldn't necessarily be maybe a horrible thing, right? You can just rebuild your images, but, some data that you might have will get removed as well. You can also clean up these files on disk by just removing varlib docker and varlib containerd. This is going to have a lot of files here. For example, we can go and take a look here. I'm not going to run some of these commands here because I actually want to keep these around because I'm going to switch over to using the CLI version a little bit later, and I don't want to lose all the different things that I had. But if we go here, let me just copy this path here. Why not? Now we can get all sorts of different stats about this directory, how big it is, etc. You will need to use sudo for this command here. I'm just going to use dust because I have it installed here. But the takeaway here, it's kind of just going to go through that directory, accumulate all sorts of different information about it, and then present how much data is actually here. So in that directory, you can see there's about 22 gigs of files. This is all sorts of different Docker images that I have built. If you don't have dust installed, it's not a big deal here. It's a little bit faster than running something like du. But in any case here, cool, that's that directory. And then we also have varlib docker, which let me go and run that. You can see about 300 megs here. Let me clear the screen just so you can see both here. And again, you can see some of my projects here. Not a big deal, but yeah, they're just using up some space here. But if you wanted to clean all that stuff up, because again, the Docker engine with Docker Desktop is going to be in the VM, then you can delete this stuff if you want to. But yeah, everything in Substance at this point has been removed, and we're actually ready to install Docker Desktop here. And we're going to use the AUR to install Docker Desktop, but don't worry, it's maintained by Docker. Now, if using the AUR is out of the question for you, that's totally okay because, Docker's documentation here has some steps that you can do if you don't want to use the AUR. For example, you can download this, run these two commands here, And then you can also just install the package directly with pacman here if you want to do that. With that said, we are going to be using the AUR here. So I have yay installed, so I can just yay install Docker Desktop like this. If you have Paru installed or another AUR helper, feel free to use those commands instead, but I'm going to run it this way. And, talking about what I meant before here, eventually throughout this process here, this will install Docker Desktop. But if we didn't explicitly remove Docker buildx and compose previously, then at some point, this would just confirm to be like, hey, by the way, do you want to remove these conflicting packages? In this case here, we're going to do A here. We're going to agree to all in this case here. And then we're also going to show the diffs as well, because that's a really good idea just to see what's happening here. That pkg build here, you can see there's all sorts of different information here. You can see Luciano from Docker, etc. But yeah, you just want to make sure maybe this is not going to do anything too crazy. You can actually see some of the dependencies of Docker Desktop. You can see right here, it is going to install Docker. It's also going to install QEMU and then curl and some other things as well. Maybe you have some of this stuff on your system. And you can see also it conflicts with Docker Compose. It conflicts with Docker buildx. So, these are why we uninstalled them before, because it provides its own version of these as well. So yeah, you can kind of just see all the different steps that it's doing. Okay, cool. And then it's like, yep, there's a post-install upgrade step, all these different things here. I've already vetted this stuff. I 100% trust it. If you want to spend more time going through this, you totally can. But in this case here, I am going to proceed with the installation. I feel very safe doing this. It's on the AUR. I tend to use the AUR very sparingly with DotFriedRice. Only 2 packages basically are being used there. And if you want to install Docker Desktop, that would be 3. But in this case here, it's got to download Docker Desktop first before it actually can, install all the things that it needs to do here. Shouldn't take too long. It is pretty big though, I will say. But yeah, in this case here, there it is, verifying some stuff. Do we want to remove the dependencies after install? Yes, we do. Do we want to proceed with the installation? Yes, we do for the dependencies here. We're going to get into why it's installing pass here in a little bit. Don't worry, it's for signing into Docker Desktop. But in this case here, yep, it's going to do its thing. Cool, it's going to, whatever, it's running through the steps that it's doing to install the package for you. This is kind of the benefit of having a package, right? All the scripts to install everything, it is handled by the maintainers there. You don't need to worry about running, 40 different commands manually. So yeah, this will take a minute or two to install. What we're seeing here, these errors is not a big deal. They're not going to have an impact on things. Yeah, I'll pause the video here and just cut it back when this is completed. It looks like it got past that point. Now it's doing some other things here as well. All right, here we go. We got past all those different steps here. And now it's going to be like, hey, by the way, do you want to proceed with the installation here for installing Docker Desktop? And yes, we do. So now it's going to run through here and actually install Docker Desktop. You can see it right away. Docker Desktop is giving us some information here. We need to accept their terms of service. Yep, that looks good to me. Now it's going to ask you if you want to sign into Docker Desktop here. In this case, we're going to skip, but we will sign into Docker Desktop in a bit here. No worries. But yeah, Docker Desktop is actually successfully installed here. Right now it's running full screen because that's how I have things set up while recording videos here. And by the way, if you are using DotFriedRice, I'm using Waybar up top here. The Docker Desktop icon is going to be tucked away here. You can just right click it to get information about Docker Desktop there. But let's go back to the blog post and then we'll jump back over here in a little bit. But yeah, okay, so everything is installed there. If you haven't made that adjustment here, getting your user to be in the Docker group, I'll run that over here just so we can see here the output of there. If I do an ID here, you can see that my user is in the Docker group. I've already logged out and logged back in. But in that case here, one thing that you might want to do, and I definitely would, and I do on my laptop, you want to make sure Docker Desktop is going to be enabled when you boot up and also started right now. So you can go and run this command here. I'm not going to bother running it just because, I'm going to be switching back over to the CLI version for the desktop. But yeah, you can run that here. Docker Desktop will start when your machine starts, which is probably what you want in my opinion. But if you don't want that, then you can skip running that here. But yeah, you're good to go to launch Docker Desktop and try it out. I'm actually going to edit this blog post because it looks like, nowadays Docker Desktop will actually launch for you immediately. So yep, there's that. And now you can start opening up the Docker Desktop application. You can also, if you have like some type of way to launch applications, it's just a desktop app. So you can do a search for Docker Desktop here. You can run it just like that. And that's going to bring things up there. And then, yeah, this kind of goes over the status bar here. If you're using Waybar, there's like hidden applications here. It really depends on whatever setup that you have. But yeah, let's go back to the terminal here and run some welcome containers here and just make sure things are working. There it is. You can see it's actually downloading it from the Docker Hub. Why? Because this is running in the Docker Desktop VM. It's no longer running on my host. And as you saw before in the video, things were set up on my host directly before. But yeah, there we go. We're all set. So we can do a Docker info here, get more information about things. We can see, the runtime is all set up through Docker Desktop. And actually, if we go back to the blog post, then yeah, you could do a buildx version and a compose version. Why not? Let's do it. So Docker buildx version. And then we can also do the same thing for compose version. And there we go. We can see all sorts of different things. You can see in this case here, it is using Docker Desktop. Cool. So now let's go over signing into a Docker Desktop. It actually uses a GPG key along with the pass command line utility. It's basically a password manager, and it is installed by Docker Desktop, as we saw there when we were looking over the package build file. But yeah, it's going to store your credentials for the Docker hub, your email and your password. This is something you only have to do once. And if you already have pass set up, then you can skip this step and sign directly into the Docker Desktop there. Now, if you don't have a GPG key, I did write a blog post on setting all that up, even made a video about that one. So I'll link that if you want to check it out there. Now, if your GPG key's email address is different than your Docker hub, that's totally fine. These are completely separate things. But yeah, once you have your GPG key, then you can run pass init and then pop in your email address. So that's my email address here. I'm actually going to have to do this here because yeah, we're doing this together, right? So let's do pass init here. I'm going to pop in my email address. That's spelled correctly. Yep. And then we do this, and then it's going to make a directory here. Now this directory path here might be a little bit different on your end. I just like this stuff to go into my config directory instead of home directory by default. So DotFriedRice will configure that ahead of time for you. But in this case here, everything is good to go. I will mention here too, though, if you just happen to have multiple GPG keys with the same exact email address, then instead of using your email address when you do init, you're going to have to use your public key ID here. This goes on to show like how you can actually run that here. You can do a GPG list keys, and then yeah, you could just do this, and then you can grab this value here, and then you would just do a pass init on this value instead of the email address. Again, that only matters if you have multiple GPG keys with the same email address. So yeah, once all that's set up here, we can actually sign into Docker Desktop here, and let's see if it works. So we could just do something like Docker login. It's going to do it from the terminal here, but that will sign us into Docker Desktop here. You could see press enter or click here. So I'm going to hit enter here, and that should pop open a browser tab. And yeah, we'll confirm this is what we want to do here. And congratulations, you're all set. Device is now connected here. So let's give it a second here. You can see login succeeded. I'm going to go here to the top bar, and we can see now we're actually logged into Docker Desktop here. So before, when we were playing around with Docker Desktop, and let's go here, you could see now there is my avatar. I am signed into Docker Desktop. I am ready to go. Hopefully it worked the same for you as well. If you did come into some issues here where this is failing, let us know in the comments below. I actually had to pause the video here. If you're really paying close attention here, this timestamp is a little bit different than where it was before. Spoiler alert, I did a hard cut here. I actually had to change my GPT key to give it ultimate trust for this to work. So yeah, on the laptop, I generated a different key using DotFriedRice where that was already set up by default. But on my personal machine, I've been lugging around my GPG key from 8-10 years ago, and it didn't have that. So in case you run into that issue, then yeah, here are some of the steps I took here. For example, if we go and take a look here now at the new output for this, you can see that's changed to ultimate. Before it said unknown. So the command that I ran here to get all this to work was GPG and then edit key, and then I put in my email address here. And again, if you have multiple GPG keys with the same email, then you can use the ID there. But in this case here, we are going to trust, and then I want to trust it ultimately, number 5 here. And then, yep, we want to confirm that, and then we can quit this out, and that is going to give you this here, where now you have ultimate trust there. That is how to get that set up. Again, you only need to do that if you got the error there when trying to sign into Docker Desktop. So let's go back to the blog post over here. And yeah, there's some settings that you might want to tweak. For example, under resources. So let's go and check that out here. If we go under resources here, by the way, this is the settings icon up here to get to where we are. We go to resources here. Again, this is going to really be dependent on your machine setup here. But it's using all the different CPU cores. And then it's also using about 25% of my memory here. I have 16 gigs. It's using 4. And then yeah, use a little bit of swap if you want. And then yeah, I have a pretty wimpy SSD here, 256 gigs. It will allocate all that if it happens to need it. But in any case here, if you want to cap these down to different values or maybe increase it to half the memory or something, you can just kind of, play around with these sliders however you see fit here. And then you can just apply and restart here. And there's other settings here, if you might want to play around with a little bit later on your own time. But yeah, feel free to explore. Now up here, I do have a business account here for Docker Desktop because I am a Docker captain. They give us that capabilities here so we can test things out. Yours might say personal, but it depends on whatever plan that you have here. But yeah, let's go back down to here. That's basically it. If you happen to be using DotFriedRice and you don't want to go through all the different steps that we took here, then it will automate a whole lot of that for you. For example, if you just use DotFriedRice with no configuration at all, it'll install Docker Engine, BuildX, Compose, and then yeah, you'll be all set up. Your user will be in the Docker group there, and then also Docker will be automatically set up to start on boot here. That gives you a fully working CLI solution to run Docker and Docker Compose projects. But let's say that you do want to use Docker Desktop instead. So then what you could do though is go to your config file. For example, if we go and pounce over here, .friedrice, a little alias there. If we go to my config, then yeah, if we go and scroll up to where we need to edit here, if we go back to the blog post, it says for pacman GUI skip, we're going to skip installing Docker build X and skip installing Docker compose. So I'm not going to go through the motions of doing all this here, but if we go to that, pacman GUI skip here, I'll copy it just for now. I'm not going to save the file, but if you go to pacman GUI skip here, yeah, this is where we would just go and skip those packages here. And then when it comes to actually packages AUR extras, because that's where we want to actually install Docker Desktop here. And we go back to the blog post, it's basically what it says over here. And then you can just run .friedrice like usual here to update your system, and that will install and configure everything for you here. It also will handle those conflicting packages, right? If you're switching over to Docker Desktop from the CLI version, yay, the package manager there, that's going to handle removing conflicts. You just have to agree to it by hitting yes a couple of different times here. And then, yeah, as you saw, Docker Desktop will take a couple minutes to install. Also, nice little convenience things for .friedrice there. When Docker Desktop is detected to be installed here, it's automatically going to handle disabling that normal Docker service for you. And it's also going to initialize a password store for you using your GPG key, because .friedrice sets up a GPG key for you. But it's not going to go and delete anything from Verilib, Docker, or Containerd. Those are really personal decisions here, and you might want to go and clean that up later. Now, the last thing here is to bring things full circle, I suppose. Again, this is optional steps here, but if you ever want to switch over from Docker Desktop back to the CLI version, then you can just remove the Docker Desktop package here, and then also do some steps, which we are going to do in a sec here. So yeah, let me just go ahead and run this here. We're going to remove the Docker Desktop package. Again, you don't need to follow along if you want to keep Docker Desktop, because I do keep it on my laptop. And this should finish however long it takes here. It is going to be uninstalling pass as well. But again, if you explicitly installed pass as a top-line dependency, then that wouldn't be removed. Then there we go. Docker Desktop has been removed. Now, the next step here is going to be deleting a line from your Docker config file, as well as doing a Docker logout. So let's see if I can produce the error here, because I noticed I had this problem on my laptop as well. For example, let's just do, a very quick Docker container run, and then we'll do, I'll just run Nginx or something where I need to pull an image from the Docker Hub because I know I don't have it. You can see, well, right away, this is not going to work because Docker isn't installed. So let me go and install Docker as well. So let's do let's just go back to the blog post here and then just grab this command here. Yep, we need to run that. Sure. All right, that finished successfully here. Can we do a Docker info? And let's see. All right, that didn't work. That is pretty normal here because Docker actually isn't running. So let's start it. Let's do sudo systemctl, and then we will enable now docker.service. Cool. I'll also make sure to put that in the blog post because I don't think I called that out there. Yeah, I didn't. So now that Docker is running, let's do a Docker info. Nice, everything is good to go here. Cool. But if we do try to do that command that we ran before here, this one here, I'm wondering if this is going to fail. Yeah, perfect. Awesome. So I'm actually going to include this output in the blog post because, yeah, you could see it's trying to still reference things from Docker Desktop here. So what we need to do here is basically remove this line from our .docker config file. Now, this file does have credentials in it. And, just to be safe on video, I'm actually not going to do this one on video. So let me swap over to here. I'm just going to bring that over to my second monitor here. And yeah, you're going to get to see me ramble here, but not actually see anything. So there's the Docker config file, config.json, sure. Yep, that line is there. I'm just removing it now. Actually, there isn't anything sensitive in here. So let me bring it back over so you can see here. All I did here literally was I just took this line here, I removed it, and that's it. So right click that out, and then we can see, go back to the blog post. Then we can do a Docker logout from your terminal. So let's do that. Docker, if I can spell, logout. There we go. We are removed there. And then, yeah, now we should actually be able to run this command here without any issues here. And boom, we're back in business here. So yeah, if you do get this error there, that's how you can solve that one. Not a big deal. But yeah, with that said, that's pretty much everything here, getting set up with Docker with and without Docker Desktop on Arch Linux. Here, let us know if you're going to be using Docker Desktop on Arch Linux. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer all of them. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.